Hello and welcome to the Neurodivergence and Mental Health podcast. My name is Sally Nilsson and I'm a psychotherapist, published author, public speaker and mum. I discovered my autism and ADHD aged 56 in March 2021, and having rewritten my life story, I'm on a quest to advocate for neurodivergent community. I hope you enjoy listening to my incredible guests sharing their experiences of autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, Tourette's and OCD. We talk about growing up, education, work and personal stories, and how mental health has played its part in shaping lives. Our conversations cover spectrums, traits, challenges, acceptance and successes. So sit back, relax and find out what it means to feel, think and be different in a neurotypical world. Please note that for this episode there will be mention of suicide and surgical procedures. Thank you. Very nice to meet you, Paul. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. And what I normally like to do, if it's okay, is just ask you to introduce yourself in any way you want. So the floor is yours. How would you like to introduce yourself today?
Yeah, so my name's Paul Isaacs. I've been an advocate for around 11 years and I've spoken around the UK for that amount of time as well. I've been blogging for around 5 or 6 years, I believe. I've authored 5 books around the subject of autism. I've been a part recently of the CBeebies TV show cartoon by Paper Owl Films called Pablo, which is about a little boy with autism, which was fantastic to be a part of as a creative consultant. And I continue, even though the pandemic's hit, to do presentations around autism. I was diagnosed with autism around 11 years ago at the age of 24 and OCD, and then I was diagnosed in 2012 with visual perceptual disorders, hence why I've got these tints and learning difficulties. My developmental trajectory was, if I was diagnosed in the 80s, early 90s, it would have been a classic autism. And I didn't get in functional speech until around 7 or 8 years old. So it just gives you a brief outline of me and just Brilliant. A bit of my developmental history.
Yeah, that's excellent. And you were diagnosed. What was happening when you were a child then? Because this is what we're going to talk about. It's about you growing up and the school years. So, you know, you're still quite young, really. And, you know, people did know about ADHD and autism, you know, say, I don't know, 20, 18, 16 years ago. What was happening to you during school?
If we go way back until
to primary and middle
preschool, my memories are tactile associative, I suppose. So all the memories were funneled through that area, and later memories gain association. So my mum initially thought I was deaf and blind around 6 months old, but it was nothing to do with my sensory organs. It was to do with perception and information processing and language processing disorders. So when I was in that environment, I couldn't filter language with meaning. I couldn't see with coherence. So faces, people, object, places, etc. I didn't recognise my body as a whole. So all I can remember doing at preschool was running round and then sitting down and then running round and sitting down at certain points of the day, and then coming home. But in terms of language, filtered language, it wasn't going in interpretively.
So just on the language, that's quite interesting. So on a day-to-day basis, how, because people talk about working harder with nonverbal, people now, and they're able to much better communicate. But when you were a kid and you were nonverbal, what were teachers and other children and even your mum and dad sort of saying when you weren't able to speak?
So yeah, I mean there was echolalia, but there wasn't functional speech. So
and just say what echolalia is. I know a bit about that.
The echoing of words, and that is a typical stage of development that all human beings go through. It's just the fact that in my case and other people's who have a similar profile cases, it's elongated because of different information processing challenges. So initially, my parents, or particularly my mother, was observing, because I'm an only child and I was first, obviously. She's looking around the neighbourhood and obviously noticing that I wasn't picking up on milestones. In fact, before I got up to my feet, and that was delayed between 16 and 18 months there. She noted that I used to crawl on the floor with one arm with my legs splayed out. So it appeared that I was physically disabled, although that wasn't the case. So that was noted. There were other things that happened which further derailed my language. Having a circumcision, for example, at a young age, I was getting UTIs. I was in pain, and they've done.
And why did you have a circumcision? Was it?
It's too tight. The foreskin was too tight.
Oh, okay.
And what happened is, and they've done studies on men that have circumcisions. So this isn't completely out there or weird or strange or peculiar. Can go through issues around gender identity, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders in later life, issues around phantom limb syndrome, because they're not able to internalize the experience. And that happened to me. Not only did I have a circumcision, I had grommets for glue ear, and I had an adenoidectomy.
And that seems, when it's an awful thing, and I never want to be ableist or anything like that. But when I was younger and I did see autism around me, they always seem to have grommets and, and difficult speech and, the behavior and everything else. And it just seemed, that is how we saw autism, really,
Yes, you're absolutely right. That there were these other factors contributing to what the main challenge is, or rather looking at the other way around, they were external things compacting and exacerbating, and in my case, derailing development, because my trajectory was already shaky anyway. But that did have a profound effect on my language and development.
By the time you, I seem to be echoing a little bit. By the time you had found speech, you've mentioned learning difficulties, and sometimes on the autism spectrum there is learning difficulties, but sometimes there aren't, because it's just a different way of being wired, a different way. It's a neurodevelopmental thing. But you're a very bright person, and you're articulate and everything else. At what point, if it happened in the schooling, did you sort of catch up or start reading or start communicating or show that you were articulate and that you were bright? I mean, did that happen or not?
I don't think it happened completely, but to give an example, when I was in year one, I couldn't process books very well. So a teacher would read me a book and maybe I could echo it back. but it wasn't internalising.
Yeah.
And the teacher said, I don't know what to do with him. And sadly, she said that to another parent rather than going to maybe another teacher or head teacher. So around year 4, when functional speech did come, it felt foreign to what I was already used to, or developmentally what I was doing. So it's kind of switching between sensing world, the pattern, theme and feel world.
So that was your own language in a way, wasn't it?
It was, yes. And it's that's a term coined by Donna Williams of sort of pattern. It was pattern, themed and felt as opposed to be interpretive. So all my human emotions had linchpins. It's just that they were funneled from things that were considered unusual. So when I started to speak functionally, it felt very difficult and it felt laboured and it was stilted. And the other condition that I had was exposure anxiety. So that further impacted when I had functional speech. I actually wanted to go back to not, because exposure anxiety was a nervous system response to not to a negative response, by the way, to having a sense of self being made aware of. So it's almost like embarrassment, but turn up to 1,000. So
is that anything like, so because I'm a psychotherapist and I deal with phobia, and some therapy is really bad with that type of exposure therapy, for instance, spiders. Now, I wouldn't suddenly get spiders in the room and get books of spiders and do all this kind of stuff. I wouldn't do that to help somebody with a fear of spiders. But for you, when you were being taught the language, was it just too much? You were getting, there was just too much coming at you about language that it was making you anxious? Is it a bit like that?
There's a mixture of current information processing challenges. So the fact that I still had and do have now a residual language processing disorder, the fact that that was there but to a much more severe degree, the fact that I had visual perceptual disorders, I was object blind, meaning blind, context blind. So that was all to do with visual verbal association. And the fact that I had no visual memory, so I had aphantasia, so I don't have a mind's eye, so I was tactile associative. So that's all the information processing stuff. Then you've got the environmental things that I've mentioned, such as trauma. And then the exposure anxiety was the fight, flight and freeze response, the head trigger response to making other people making me aware of myself. So if anybody made me aware of myself, I would detach, would dissociate. And I dissociate primarily for 2 reasons. Firstly, to do with language processing. I was actually traumatized by language, people speaking to me. And that's something that seems quite peculiar, but if you lived in my world, it would make perfect sense. And then the other reason was exposure anxiety, so a reaction to exposure anxiety.
So when you say that, can I just put something in there? There's 2 things that just jump into my head then that are quite, yes, that you might agree with, I'm not sure. But one of them is pathological demand avoidance, is in, you're talking about language, but it's all language, but would it also incorporate anybody asking you to do something would just be impossible to do?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't the fact that I was triggered by demands. I was triggered by anybody making me aware of my own existence.
Incredible. So give me an example of a teacher and what they would say to you.
A teacher coming up to me, saying my name, being directly confrontational, being direct with their language.
gosh.
What I would have needed, which I've learned now, speaking to Donna and understanding about exposure anxiety, and it ports over quite nicely the strategies with pathological demand avoidance, ODD, reactive attachment disorder, is a more indirect confrontational approach, which would have would have done for me at that point in time. It would have freed up space for me to take in information rather than my nervous system constantly being on alert and constantly on fire. Effectively, it's constantly being struck.
I really understand. I it's a big and complex subject, but I understand what you're saying, and we'll come on to this because that's almost like my final question I ask my guests is, how can that be better in schools? But I'll ask you about that later. But the other thing that you're saying though, which is my journey all started really because I was getting clients coming in who were dissociating, shutting down, melting down, hypersensitive, crying, angry, and doing all of this. And I hadn't seen it before. And it was during COVID. And I was thinking, this is incredible. And that sent me on a journey to polyvagal theory, because I was very interested in Stephen Porges. Do you know about polyvagal theory?
No, if you explain.
Just very briefly, Stephen Porges, it's to do with the vagus nerve. So it's if you get to the point of fight, flight, and freeze, if you can't fight and you can't get away from it, and freezing doesn't work as well, you can get so anxious about it that you just go into like a death feign. And a really good way of explaining this is if there's a fox and a rabbit, and the fox catches the rabbit it knows it's going to be eaten and it doesn't want to feel pain. So it floods itself with endorphins. Its breathing goes right down, its heart rate goes right down, and it goes into a completely flop situation because it just doesn't want to feel pain of being eaten and death. So as mammals started to progress and evolve more, we developed our own way of doing this, and it's to do with the vagus nerve. So the top part of the vagus nerve, which is at the back beneath the cerebellum, that deals with when you go into panic, all the breathing and the heart and all that side of it. And there's another part of the polyvagus, the vagus nerve, which goes down, that deals with the stomach. So when saber-toothed tigers were chasing us when we were, millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years ago, we would do two things. We would faint and we would lose our bowels, so that by the time the tiger got to us, he'd think, well, that's dead, that's not much fun, and it smells awful, so I'll go away, giving us enough time to run away, like with a lion and an antelope. So it's fascinating. I find polyvagal very, very fascinating, and it's similar. So that's why a lot of people who have high stress, and in autism as well, it's because they're constantly stressed. Their body is constantly traumatized. It's a bit like complex trauma that Paul Micallef talks about on YouTube. He's quite good as well.
Yes.
But for you, for instance, if I'm on the right track, is that I feel it must have been awful. You're constantly at school in this situation where everything is so triggering and so stressful.
Yeah,
it shuts you down and melts you down.
Well, yeah, I had no escape. So from the age of 3 to 16, it was constant bullying. So it wasn't just bullying at school; it was bullying in my home environment, my peer group, adults, where I live. And it was only until age 30 that I had a break from bullying at work. So you can kind of do the math there of how long that went on for. But the way in which I got round that is I thanked them, every one of them, for treating me the way they did, because it gave me a framework of how not to treat people. And
totally
it gave me
with you from a person who I'm not going to tell you my story because yours is much more interesting, but very badly bullied because I'm autistic and ADHD as well. So I was just causing so much havoc, really, and people were being horrible to me. And an off makes you strong, doesn't it, Paul?
Yes, it does. I mean, you have to understand the psychology of why people behave the way they do towards you. And it's absolutely to do with them their biases, their internalizations, their rationalizations, their caregivers, their environment, their core beliefs, all has an impact on how one projects. So a lot of the people who at that stage in their life who came across me and other people similar to me, they would do these things because they were unhappy. And all I wish them is wellness. I don't think about them all the time because that's inappropriate, but I do wish them wellness, contentment, and to be the best version of themselves. So I don't hold bitterness towards people.
I love that. I really love that.
That doesn't mean that I'm unaware of how people behave, and it doesn't mean that people's behaviour doesn't have an effect on me currently.
Yeah.
But what that does mean is that I let go, and letting go is the most powerful thing you can do, because all you've got from birth to death is yourself. And if you don't like yourself or have some sort of framework where you're living perceived self rather than actual self, which is a paradox which I think more people go through than they care to admit.
Yes.
Then you're living through the lens of someone's idea of you rather than being who you really are.
And I really like that, you know, what you're saying. And if you don't mind, if I just come in on that, because you know, one of the things with double empathy, and also the thing about sharing stories so that you understand and everything else, is you know, I'm writing my autobiography, purely because I've just rewritten my whole life, and all my life I thought I was mentally ill, and I wasn't.
A lot of people do.
And I just was autistic and ADHD. And the thing was, is I thought I had to forgive all these people and forgive myself. And I don't even have to do that. I just understand now. I understand why these things happened. And I understand why I, excuse the French, piss people off, and why things didn't work. And the weight that gets lifted off your shoulders when you realize, oh, that's why, you know, it just changes the narrative. And gives you freedom.
You don't have to be successful. You only have to be happy.
Yeah.
Success is an arbitrary hierarchical fallacy which people fall into all the time. They think that success is out there when it's in here.
Yeah.
And that is why the Western world has made people crazy, because it's all built on this arbitrary construct of being better than someone, being grander than someone, having more money than someone. And that is why people are disillusioned. One of the most unhappiest places to live is London.
Oh, absolutely. So
and particularly
as well.
Particularly the sensory deprivation. And I spoke to a gentleman many years ago who was doing studies around mental health in London and these communities that are very dense.
Yes, yeah.
And the sensory deprivation alone from the subways, you know, the underground, was awful. I mean, I love them, but I love them because I get so euphoric with colours and lights and shimmer and shine, and I have to try and distract myself. But for some people, because for me it was exciting, partly because I'm going to do a speech, or I'm going to a school, or I'm going up north. It was a through lane. But for some people, that is everyday life. That is mundane. They have to get up at 5 o'clock and then take that route to work for 40 years or more. And it's very, very demoralising. So I think that we have to wonder why in America and in the UK and in the so-called developed world, which I think is a slightly condescending and offensive term, it's implying that there are other places that aren't developed, actually have lost lots of things that we could learn from the African continent and Africans, from the tribes, from the Aborigines, and from the Native American Indians. And they, if there is a God, I don't want to get religious, but if there is a God, they were probably closest to it.
And just on that, that's so fascinating and very, very interesting. I'm a human givens therapist, and I take what I need from my model of therapy. I don't have to do 100% because maybe there's some bits that I don't completely see eye to eye to. But one of the things that they said, and it does make sense to me, is we are human beings. We're a species. We are a species. So I'm not into hierarchy, and I'm very into justice, and I wish people would look after each other a lot more. But on population and on being within places, we're not really supposed to have more than 150 people around us, because we're nomads and we're supposed to be tribal. And although we connect, there's too many people on top of each other, and it's not supposed to be like that. And it's made us all crazy because, as you say, there's far too much stimuli coming in, and there's lots of other things as well, of course.
Yes.
Materialism and institutions, but hierarchy is quite a big thing, because I could quite easily, if you were the queen or if you were somebody else, I would be talking to you exactly the same, because that's the way my mind works. We all have the same voice to speak, and we should be able to talk to each other. But it does make it difficult. I want to make sure I get in lots of really interesting things with you, Paul. So if I may, you exude strength from a lot of adversity that I know from just talking to you now that you would have experienced. But I would like to ask you, how has your mental health been affected? The bits that you remember the most because of your neurodivergence.
I would say in the late 2000s, when I attempted suicide, and that was around 2007. And that was a mixture of things. That was a mixture to do with the environment where I was living, which was kind of worrying, because my mother noted to me around a week ago or two, I think a week, give or take, that actually 4 people in my village have killed themselves, which is rather worrying. All men, and hung themselves.
Oh.
So.
And why? Why do you think that's
I don't know. I mean, she had a theory about one of the gentlemen, but it was just a theory that he may have been gay, and he hung himself in the woods near here, alone. And it is and I think it sounds obvious, but it is a lonely process, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because I think people forget that you are cutting yourself off in every sense of the word, aren't you? You're cutting your mind almost into, you're working on a different level because you're committed to doing this one act. And I left a suicide note because I planned to do it in my bedroom, and I left a suicide note. I was planning to hang myself from the railing of the curtains, and then for some reason something hit me, which thank goodness it did, and I just can't.
What, literally? Did something hit you literally?
No. I think in my mind. You
had a thought or
something to take me out of what sadly happens, because if you're so driven.
Yes. Oh, you're in trance.
Yes. Yeah. It's a peculiar experience, but I went back to bed, thankfully. Yeah. But obviously it upset my parents deeply because my mother found the note.
Of course.
Yes. So that was.
And you're very close to your family. Do you still have both your mum and dad?
Luckily, yes. I mean, I almost lost my dad in 2011 and my mum in 2019. So I'm thankful for them to still be here.
When that happens, can I just ask that? Because when that happens, because I nearly lost my mum in April. She was in hospital for 3 weeks. When that happens, how does that change the way you think about your parents' mortality?
Well, with my mother, it was it was a completely different context. So it happened all of a sudden. So she got diagnosed with a condition called thrombosis of the vena cava. So basically she had a clot from her heart all the way down to her liver. They couldn't believe it.
Oh.
And it was also trailing into her kidneys. So she was at risk of dying, obviously.
Yes.
She was at risk of having an embolism,
Yes.
the thrombus breaking off. She almost died 3 times. She had lung failure in one of the operations.
Very serious.
And yes, it was. Yeah, she's intensive care for 2 weeks. And I have to give it to the team who were around her and all these very poorly people, because you had to walk in and you saw them. You know, it wasn't just my mum.
Yeah.
They were extremely dedicated, and actually I had a very positive experience in terms of staff.
Well, and I do with the NHS. I think they're absolutely incredible, and the number of different times been in hospital. It's one of those things, as long as you're told straightforward, honestly, openly, and you're not condescended to, and they say, like with my dad, they said, look, he's got pneumonia in 2 lungs, he's going to die. So I said, okay, 4 days in hospital. I just wanted to know what he was going to look like when he died and how his heart was going to be. And I went into practical mode right up until his last breath. But how's your mum now?
Yeah, she's still recovering, but she's slowly recovering in the sense mental health. I think there's PTSD there. Because
unsurprisingly, with the procedure she must have had to have for that.
Her breathing's changed, but it's not her literal breathing, it's from her throat, because Farah and I were there when they took the plastic out of her throat, and for when she was at home, she used to make this sort of wheeze sound from her throat, and I said, I think that's to do with your unconscious mind.
Yes.
Either remembering the lung failure, or potentially both, or remembering the removal of the tube, because she breathes from her throat, and I have said you breathe differently now.
Have you read about that since COVID, that a lot of the people who were ventilated, a lot of the people that ventilated have got PTSD because of the actual equipment that was in there?
Yes, it doesn't surprise me one bit, not at all, because it's artificial.
Oh, it's awful. But PTSD after lots of procedures is something I see quite a lot. And
I'm sure.
Thank you for telling me that, and I'm glad that your mum is recovering.
Yes, she is.
I just want to make sure, because we get an hour, and I just want to make sure if it's okay with you. There was a bit, hang on, let me see, where are we on time? Okay, because I want to talk about the wonderful stuff that you're doing as well. But you were misdiagnosed, and I was as well, and actually with lots of counselling, which was incorrect as well. I now realise now that I'm autistic. But how were you misdiagnosed? And what were they misdiagnosing you with before they finally came up with what you agreed with?
This is where I kind of go a bit differently. I didn't consider them misdiagnoses, because if a human being is pushed, this is my own experience. I'm not speaking for all, because misdiagnosis is valid. So as I carry on with this, I'm just contextualising my own story. So we all have between 4 to 6 personality types, human beings. And if those personality types are pushed, they go into the disordered extremes. So I don't disagree with the diagnoses of borderline and schizotypal personality disorder, because at that point in time I was so ill that the environmental impact, the barrage of different things happening in my life at that time meant that I was very ill. And I also had psychosis for a brief time.
But that can come on with terrible stress, can't it?
Yeah, and auditory hallucinations.
Yes.
So it wasn't the fact that it was a misdiagnosis in that sense.
Yeah.
However, the conclusion was a misdiagnosis because I had those. But then I think the last meeting I had with the mental health professional, he said I had Asperger traits with a complex personality. And it was quite arbitrary, and
Yeah.
it was,
Apologized.
yeah. And not only that, it didn't take me anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, the first thing I said was, "What was that?" And he couldn't really answer.
I read it in a book.
Yes, yeah. He was an
Yeah.
he was an old-fashioned professional, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way. He was probably coming to the end of his career.
Yeah.
He must have been in his 60s.
Yes.
When he saw me. So all that lens
Yeah.
of which he was looking at me through was dated.
But that's so, I find it incredibly laudable, and really the way that you speak, if you don't mind me saying, well, considering that you don't, when you were younger, you couldn't stand sort of people sort of talking about you, but you know, the way that you are so understanding, I mean, you know, it's
well,
incredible.
I didn't want to become bitter and twisted.
And I totally agree, and you know, and I don't either, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. But this leads quite well onto the kind of stuff that you're doing now. When we were talking about mental health, and something I saw on the YouTube, which was really great with Anna Kennedy, because I have my own ways of doing mindfulness, and I don't do the sort of typical mindfulness, because actually, if you lay me down on the ground and I'm saying Om, and you're making me very, very quiet, and I get too emotional and I get angry and I don't like it. So I have my own way of doing mindfulness. And you have your ways of doing mindfulness as well. How do you do mindfulness? What are your tips?
Well, I think I mentioned in that workshop what works for me is poetry and creative writing, creating things that have an emotional connection. And I have pre-attentive thinking, which isn't unique to autism, but it may garner it because of the information processing challenges I have. So I don't always consciously think what I'm going to write, particularly emotive writing, which seems to come from another place. And also the same with some of my illustrations, they're just drawn. I may have a basic framework of an idea, but it just happens.
Who's attracted to that when they read your work? What sort of comments and reviews do you get, as far as, you know, because that way of writing is so organic and really natural, and it comes from such an interesting place. I'd be very interested to know the people that love your work, you know, what sort of things do they say about it when they read your books?
What I hope, and to galvanise lots of people's views into one observation of what they may think of me, is that I was true to myself and authentic. And I don't really mind what people say about me in the broader sense, because you always have to go back to who you really are. So I don't necessarily want people to listen to me, the person. I just want people to remember what I said.
Yes, yeah, and that is, yeah, I totally agree with you. And the sad thing is, and I just find that in sorry, but I do find this in the neurotypical world a lot, is that people just aren't honest, and they're not feeling their feelings, and they're not being open, and they get very angry and upset, and you know, it's quite difficult. When I'm speaking to somebody who is wired in the same way that I'm wired, we seem to have a much deeper conversation, and it goes through a different type of layering. And you come away feeling full. I'm not very great at superficial conversations, and something that is quite typical of small talk, of autism is small talk. I'm not really great at small talk either. Do you prefer a deeper level conversation when you're with another human?
It depends. What I like about people is their energy. So it's before a conversation even starts, and the system of sensing, this symbiotic sort of way of being with people. All babies have it, because the nervous system is naked, so that you merge with people quite easily. And because of the information processing challenges and the compaction of the information processing challenge meant it freed the system to be more of that of one who is sensing, rather than interpreting. And then if you live in the system of sensing, everybody is open because you can see them for who they really are. You don't need to strip any layers away. You don't need to peel any layers or draw any curtains back, because everyone is there in their raw form. So it's mergence, and I merge with people's trauma, and that's happened a few times where I have to unpick, is it mine or is it someone else's? And some people could call that telepathic or psychic ability. I don't know if it is fully in the literal sense, but I do believe that people who sense more, and that could be non-autis as well.
It is quite common within. Oh, sorry, it's going to go. It is. I'm just reading from different places, though, that there are obviously the five senses and the sixth sense, but I do think that a lot of us are very highly sensitive, and we do have this intuition, this perception, this ability to know what people are thinking before they've opened their mouths and what they're feeling, and to really sort of be part of that. I think I'm like that as well.
Unknown knowingness.
Yes.
And if you work with people who have profound information processing challenges, they're more likely to be in the system of sensing.
And that leads on very well, I think, to Ollie and his superpowers. I saw this. Oh gosh, I'm not sure where I saw it, but I went onto the website because I was trying to find out more about you, so that obviously we could have a good chat. And Alison Knowles is she's just such an incredible lady. She has a background of neurolinguistic programming and psychotherapy, and just her whole being and her aura and everything about her is amazing. But she's come up with such a fantastic method of working with children and having the boxes. And just tell me about it, if you would, in about 5 minutes. Give me a really good feel of what you're doing with Ollie and the superpowers and what it is.
Well, I first met Alison a few years ago at one of Anna Kennedy's events, one of the expos pre-COVID. And I've done some training for her team. And as we were talking at the expo during a break, and she's with one of her colleagues, what came about was actually a sharing of ideas, of the way human beings work, of the way the mind works, the way mental health works. And what Alison has got, and it's a great gift, is she's able to take in and almost remember on some level, because adults forget, what it's like to be a child, what it's like to be a young person. And as that filters through into the programs where she goes round young adults, young children, teenagers, etc., what she's trying to do is break the curse of children coming out of secondary school education with mental health challenges that they wouldn't have had. So that's across the board. I believe the worrying statistics, around 70% of teenagers come out of education with mental health problems. So her goal is to get people, and specifically children, young minds, able to understand their emotions, emotional regulation, and ultimately understand themselves. And that is why it's going round the country. That is why she has been to America. That is why her training programs are getting more and more, not notoriety, because that's the wrong word.
Well, recognition.
They're getting recognition and being embraced by the schools. And it is wonderful to talk to children anyway. I remember doing a speech about autism, and I brought up about the system of sensing, and because they're closer to that anyway, the children completely understood what I was on about. So that was just an intriguing kind of observation that kind of marries up with what Alison has observed with children and mental health around young people. And that Ollie and his superpowers is in effect a movement of change, of changing people's views of children.
And how to talk to them and communicate with them.
Yes.
Instead of everybody being the same and you know, noticing, and it's about it's talking about how they feel without it being, you know, like if you ask an autistic person, how are you? Well, it's just such a ridiculous thing to ask because it's too big and it means so much. But she's found a way of having these boxes and having a communication method that lets people in and lets people describe their emotions. Tell me about that.
Well, the way, from talking to her at the expo, her whole ethos is that people are people first. So before you get into the practicalities and the theory and even the logistics of what you're doing, it was very clear that Alison wanted to bring back this element of humanity to children, that they are not walking labels, that they are not to be defined by boxes. We had a conversation recently where we were discussing that, about these boxes and how sometimes, and not to offend people, but it's true, governing bodies around counties are failing children. There are CAMs, not to name people, and I don't want to, you know, give CAMs a black name or a darkened kind of representation or reputation. But sadly, there are practitioners within CAMs, because that's the way one should word it. There are some practitioners within CAMs who are failing children, big time.
Yeah.
They're either not listening to them, or they have, like the mental health, adult mental health practitioner I went to, potentially a fixed view of how to talk, how to manage, and how to cure, quote, the ailments. So what she's suggesting is give the power back to the people. It sounds almost liberating, but it is, because if you teach children that they can take ownership of themselves, wouldn't that be better? Wouldn't that be better if we had a society where people were not clogging up the adult mental health services? They were not clogging up CAMs. We've got to be really forward thinking, and I think that's where Ali, you know, just is forward thinking. She's thinking ahead. She's thinking of the next generation of children.
But
And
she is part of a machine, I think. Oh, sorry, the sound went a bit funny. She is she's fantastic, and there's other advocates. You are a really good advocate. The lady I spoke to this morning, she is as well. And there's so many of her. Well, I'm a newbie, but I'm going to do the best I can from 56 to the end of my life to try and do that. And there is a movement, and there is a sea change, and it's. I seem to have arrived at a place where there is change, and it will happen. And I think it can happen within a community like neurodivergency, because we're not scared of talking, and we're blunt and we're open and we're honest. And as long as we're not pitchforks at dawn, and we're trying to talk to everybody and understand everybody, because I'm not going to go to any group and people start telling me how I talk and about how I process the information and the words I use. I'm sorry, but I'm too old and ugly to do that. I need to say it how it comes out of my mouth, and it's done in a, I don't want to annoy anyone, but I can't keep changing my language every 2 seconds. I think what you're saying is absolutely right. We do almost need to go back to basics and to talk to parents about coping skills and go right back to basics about getting children to feel. I was repressed as a child, and that's why I became a rebel, because my family were, my mum and dad, who I absolutely adore, but it was do what you're told, keep quiet and speak when you're spoken to. And it was a bit of a Victorian way. But I think, babies and children, we're just mini adults. We just need guiding, and we need to help our human beings be who they are planning to be as individuals and identity. And just as if you were to sum up in literally a couple of sentences, as we sum up and come to the end of this really fascinating talk, how would you like to see society encompassing neurodivergency and helping humans in the future?
Well, to ultimately see them as people. It's as simple as that. If you do not see others as people, then there's no chance for change. If you see people as human beings, as autonomous entities that have their own thoughts, feelings, opinions, views, then you're on the road to change. But change cannot be met without people in mind. So in other words, you can put all the legislation in place, and you can say you can't do this and you can't say that, but it really is about being calm and waiting, because you can't force anybody to think the way you do. You offer it, and then they have to internalize it, but it's their choice to internalize it. You can't make anybody enlightened.
And it can't, and it would be really good if it wasn't too subjective and politicized. If there's more people just standing in the neutral zone and sharing their experiences and talking at a calm level with each other, and then other people might look at those people and think, that's really interesting what they're saying. I think I'm just going to go and sit with them and hear what they're saying, because it does sound quite good.
Yeah, that's correct. You never protest in a way which makes you appear bitter. You must protest in a way in which you know what the end result is, because you can't keep protesting all the time. There's got to be change, hasn't there?
Yeah.
There's got to be an end result. You've got to have an end game, an end result, a finite thing that you want, a goal. And if you don't have a goal and you're just walking around aimlessly, then it's never going to work. You have to have a goal.
You do have to have a goal. And Paul, I mean, I really would love to invite you back again, because my aim with the podcast is not to have thousands of people coming on to talk at all. It's to have really, you know, a group of some people who, you know, who talk in this sort of way, I suppose. And there'll be times perhaps when I'd really like to hear what you say about maybe slightly more targeted, you know, topics, you know, and get your opinion about that. But I do thank you absolutely for the time that you've spent today with me, and I'm absolutely sure that there's going to be an awful lot of people who are really going to look forward to hearing what you said and sharing your experiences in your life today. And I just, you know, thank you so much. And the podcast will be out in I'm hoping by the end of July, because I want to get everyone together and then put them out as one.
Yeah.
And I'll put what I'll do is I'll ask you separately on an email or LinkedIn or whatever, if you can give me all your links. I'll put them in the show notes, if that's okay. And
yes, yeah, that would be great. Yes,
that would be wonderful. And I really wish you all the best with Ollie and his superpowers and all the other fantastic projects and conferences and everything that you do moving forward. You're such an incredible person for our community, and thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Yeah,
have a good summer.
Care. Yeah, and you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much for listening to the Neurodivergence and Mental Health podcast. Links and resources will be at the end in the show notes. I very much look forward to meeting you again. Thanks for listening. Bye.